Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence, and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe, and share. The year was 1835, and the house in question, the Hartwell mansion, stood upon the higher ground overlooking Pittsburgh's sooty sprawl. It was not the oldest estate in the region, nor the grandest, but its proportions were imposing, brick faced with stone, a double staircase rising to a portico, and long corridors that led to chambers whose doors were seldom open. The Hartwell family were known in mercantile circles, their fortunes tied to iron and the expanding rail lines. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, whispers of unwholesome domestic affairs clung to the household like damp rot. At the center of these whispers was Margaret Dunlap Hartwell, wife to Jeremiah Hartwell, a man whose stern public character masked a more desperate private temperament. Parish registers described Margaret as of delicate constitution. Letters preserved in a cousin's album spoke of fainting spells, sleepless nights, and a curious sensitivity to light. One fragment, attributed to Margaret's own hand around 1834, reads, "There are times I cannot discern my reflection from another. She looks back at me with such fixed intensity I am unsure if it is my face at all. Jeremiah says I am overwrought, but I know she waits for me at dusk." Her decline was gradual, marked by fits of confusion and what contemporaries called nervous agitation. Neighbors reported her voice carrying through the shutters at night, speaking to someone who was not there. Servants, in depositions later redacted, confessed that the lady of the house would cover every mirror with linen before attempting to rest. Jeremiah, though not unfeeling, found his patience eroded. Physicians were summoned, first Dr. Henley of Pittsburgh, later a series of visiting men who bore the polished instruments of the new science: forceps, calipers, glass phials of tincture. They offered bleeding, laudanum, purgatives. None restored Margaret's equilibrium. An inventory note from 1835 in the Allegheny County Medical Society records lists a silver-handled lancet, blood-stained, one set of obstetrical forceps in brass, and 3 bottles labeled only tonic for hysteria. But Jeremiah's suspicion grew beyond his wife's frailty. He began to confide in letters now lost save for clerk's copies, that someone or something was interfering within his household. He claimed Margaret had taken to writing notes she could not later recall, that unfamiliar handwriting appeared in her journals, and that a second woman in the glass mocked her across the parlor mirror. The mirror woman, as it came to be known, was never spoken of publicly, but within the family it became the unvoiced terror. Elena Rodriguez Hartwell, Margaret's sister-in-law by marriage, would later testify that Margaret insisted her reflection whispered warnings in a language she could not quite grasp. What began as nervous fancy took on physical consequence. Margaret scratched at her own face to obliterate the resemblance, tearing skin with her nails until Jeremiah ordered her restrained. The official record grows deliberately vague here. Some documents from the Western Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane reference committed under her husband's guardianship in late 1835. The diagnosis, hysteria, with hallucination. Yet the letters smuggled out, to survive in brittle ink, tell another tale. They say I am ill, but I know the draught is poison. Each swallow brings the mirror woman nearer, until I feel her hand upon mine. She presses me to speak, but if I do, Jeremiah will have me silenced forever. It was around this time that Jeremiah himself reported disturbances in the mansion. Footsteps where none should be, doors ajar though locked, whispering within the walls. These he attributed to the servants, or to Margaret's contagious madness. But when family papers were later examined at trial, archivists found marginal notes in Jeremiah's own ledger. Someone tampers with her files. The tinctures are replaced. Who profits from her derangement? Whether this was genuine concern for his wife, or an attempt at self-exoneration, remains debated. Thus the story opens. A woman fading into delusion, or perhaps being driven there, her husband wavering between alarm and complicity, and a household whose very walls seemed to conspire in secrecy. The Hartwell mansion, with its sealed shutters and covered mirrors, became less a residence than a stage for shadows. Every object carried suspicion: the physician's instruments gleaming too brightly, the draughts too bitter, the servant's footsteps too soft. By year's end, Margaret would no longer appear at church or society calls. Her absence was explained as illness. But within the house, Elena swore she saw her sister-in-law sitting before the parlor mirror long after midnight, whispering to someone only she could see. What began as ordinary frailty was already shaping into something more sinister, a pattern of surveillance, of substitution, of silence testimony. The archive does not lie, though it leaves much unsaid. The following winter brought no relief to the house. Pittsburgh's air was thick with coal smoke, snow clung to the eaves of Hartwell Mansion, and inside, silence had become its own tyrant. Margaret was kept mostly in the upstairs chamber, her movements monitored, her meals prepared separate. She grew gaunt, her hair turning brittle, though her eyes when she fixed them on a mirror seemed strangely lucid. Elena, Jeremiah's sister-in-law, had taken upon herself the quiet duty of tending to Margaret in those intervals when servants were dismissed. What she witnessed unsettled her in ways she dared not commit to writing until years later. At times Margaret would speak in two voices, one hers and the other lower, measured, almost coaxing. Elena described it as if another woman were conversing from the same lips, pausing only when Margaret's body shook with exhaustion. During one of these episodes, Margaret gripped Elena's wrist and whispered, "She is not in the glass, she is behind it. Do you not see how the edges rip? It is not reflection but a window." Elena might have dismissed it as delirium had she not experienced disturbances of her own. Doors she had locked herself were found open. A small hand mirror on her dressing table showed smudges though she had not touched. Once, while brushing her hair at dusk, she saw in the corner of her mirror not her own figure, but a pale woman with loose hair staring intently forward. Elena spun around to find the room empty, yet the impression remained. When Don Carlos Rodriguez arrived from Spain in early spring of 1836, he found a household already steeped in unease. He was Elena's elder brother, a merchant with connections in Cadiz, drawn across the Atlantic by rumors of Margaret's condition and the curious silence surrounding the family letters. Don Carlos was a man of business, skeptical of superstition, yet practical enough to know that illness in such a household could easily become scandal. He intended to reassure himself, collect the facts, and return promptly to Europe. What he found, however, confounded even his skepticism. Margaret greeted him weakly, her voice frail but insistent. She clasped his hand and demanded he tell them what is being done. When asked to explain, she shivered and refused to speak further, glancing toward the curtained mirror as though fearful it might overhear. That night Don Carlos himself recorded hearing footsteps in the hallway, though he was certain no servant had been called. He opened his chamber door and discovered to his astonishment a faint line of light escaping from a seam in the paneling, what appeared to be a concealed passage. He would not investigate further until daylight, but in his journal later entered into evidence he wrote, "There are secret arteries within this house. I know now why Margaret insists she is watched. The eyes are real, the very walls harbor them." Elena felt vindicated but terrified. Margaret's visions, once explained away as hysteria, seemed to align with physical proof. If the house itself contained hidden chambers and unseen observers, then her madness was no madness at all. And yet who moved in those passages? Who replaced the tinctures in her fire? Who leaned close to her in the mirror's depth? Jeremiah grew more irritable with each passing week, alternately defending himself against insinuations and ordering harsher confinement for his wife. He accused Elena of encouraging Margaret's delusions and treating Don Carlos as an intruder rather than kin. The household was splitting along invisible seams, much like the walls themselves. By midsummer, Margaret's health was visibly failing. She often refused food, claiming it was dry. Her voice dropped into whispers whenever the subject of the mirrors arose. She spoke of the other one more often, saying she was readying herself to come through. Elena confided in Don Carlos that she no longer knew whether her sister-in-law's words were metaphor or prophecy. And always, from some hidden corridor, the sound of breathing when no one else was near. The summer of 1836 dragged on with a heavy, airless stillness inside the Hartwell mansion, a silence broken only by the ticking of clocks and the faint scurry of mice within the walls. Don Carlos, restless and increasingly disturbed by the atmosphere, resolved to investigate the seam of light he had glimpsed in the hallway. One morning, while Jeremiah was away on business, and the servants occupied with chores in the kitchens, he pressed along the wainscoting, until his hand caught a subtle indentation. With a careful push the panel shifted. A narrow passage revealed itself, exhaling a stale breath of dust and damp stone. Elena, who had followed at a distance, nearly cried out when she saw the opening. Together they slipped inside, carrying only a candle and their determination. The passage wound tightly between the outer wall and the inner rooms, its boards creaking underfoot. Dust clung to their clothing, and every sound seemed amplified, as though the house itself were listening. After a dozen paces, Don Carlos found a slit cut in the paneling, a narrow peephole overlooking Margaret's chamber. He placed his eye to it and drew back instantly, revolted. From this vantage, one could observe every movement within the room. Elena's face turned pale as she realized that Margaret's fear of constant surveillance had not been the product of a fevered mind. There were other apertures too, leading to mirrors, small cavities built behind their silvered glass, giving the impression that someone might lean forward from within and watch. A whisper, faint but real, carried along the wooden channel, confirming what Margaret had insisted. Voices in the walls, voices that could coax and torment. They stumbled further until the passage turned downward, ending in a cramped chamber. There they found a stool, a lantern, and a bundle of empty vials. The faint odor of laudanum, and something sharper, bitter almond perhaps, hung in the air. Don Carlos, who had dabbled in trade of apothecary's goods, recognized it instantly, a trace of arsenical compound. That discovery changed the nature of their fear. No longer was it the dread of phantoms, but the recognition of a human hand manipulating illness. Margaret had spoken of her food being poisoned. Elena now believed her completely. When Jeremiah returned that evening, Don Carlos attempted to confront him outright, but the merchant, cool and imperious, dismissed the accusations with practiced ease. He accused Elena of hysteria, Don Carlos of meddling, and Margaret of weaving fantasies born of fever. He even suggested that Don Carlos's presence in the household had aggravated Margaret's decline. His voice remained calm, his expression controlled, yet beneath it Elena thought she saw the flicker of something harder, something like triumph. Later, when Margaret fell into another spell, Elena heard her murmur, "The other one says he cannot keep her out much longer. She knows the way through the glass." Margaret's hand trembled as she gestured toward the mirror, her eyes wide as though expecting it to ripple open. Don Carlos was not prepared to give up. He began copying letters from Margaret's physician in Harrisburg, Dr. Zimmerman, who had written years earlier of her robust health. These records stood in sharp contrast to the current narrative Jeremiah had been spreading, that Margaret was long afflicted with fragile nerves and needed confinement. Don Carlos believed that with enough evidence, he could force an inquiry. But for every step he advanced, Jeremiah tightened the household silence. Servants were threatened into obedience, letters were intercepted, and Margaret herself was locked for longer stretches in her chamber. The mansion had become a prison, its mirrors transformed into sentinels. And though Elena and Don Carlos had uncovered proof of hidden passageways and suspicious chemicals, they still did not know the full reach of the conspiracy, or whether they themselves were being marked as the next victim. In early autumn, a chill began to creep through the Hartwell estate. Though the hearth still burned with coal, Elena felt it most keenly at night when the shadows of the mansion lengthened, and the mirrors glowed faintly in candlelight. Margaret grew weaker, her words drifting between lucidity and delirium, but when she was clear, her warnings cut deep. "He means to silence me through the glass. The woman will take my place if you do not stop him." Don Carlos urged Elena to remain steadfast. He had gathered the copied letters from Dr. Zimmerman, medical notes sent years earlier, declaring Margaret's sound of mind, praising her resilience after childbirth, and contradicting Jeremiah's recent claims that she had always been delicate, prone to fit. These documents, Don Carlos insisted, would prove the deliberate misrepresentation of her condition, but getting the letters beyond the mansion proved nearly impossible. Jeremiah's control over correspondence was absolute. The servants, bound by fear and loyalty, would not dare smuggle out a package. One maid, Anna, whispered sympathy to Elena in the pantry late one night but retracted it the next day with trembling denial, as though someone had corrected her in the interim. Then came the night Elena awoke to footsteps outside her chamber. The fire had gone low, and in the dim light she saw a glimmer at the mirror's edge, like the reflection of an eye peering from behind. She called out, but the footsteps retreated. The next morning, her jewelry box had been moved from its place. Jeremiah denied entering her room, yet the servants swore no one else had gone near. Elena began to feel the same disquiet Margaret had described, the sensation of being watched not only through keyholes, but through the very walls. Desperate, Don Carlos sought help beyond the house. He arranged a clandestine meeting with Sarah Quinn, a local woman known for her independence and sharp wit. Sarah had ties to the abolitionist community, and was unafraid of powerful men. If anyone could carry word of Jeremiah's schemes, it was she. Don Carlos entrusted her with Zimmerman's letters, begging her to find a magistrate willing to listen. Sarah agreed, though she warned him, "Men like Jeremiah build their houses on silence. If you mean to pull at the foundation, be ready for the roof to collapse on us all." Meanwhile, Margaret's visions grew dark. She began speaking of her mother,
long dead, who appeared in the glass begging her to cross over. She said the woman in the mirror was not simply a figment but a twin, waiting patiently to consume what remained of her life. One evening, Elena found Margaret clutching a broken shard from a mirror she had smashed. Her hands bloodied. She whispered, "If I break enough she cannot reach me, but he won't allow it. He puts them back, always back." Indeed, by the next day the mirror was replaced, spotless as before, as if the destruction had never occurred. Jeremiah claimed the servants had handled it, but none would admit to the task. Sarah Quinn's involvement emboldened Don Carlos. He began keeping his own written record of events. Margaret's exact words, the discovery of hidden passages, the vials in the cellar, but Jeremiah seemed to sense the threat tightening around him. His manner grew colder, his presence in the mansion heavy. When Don Carlos confronted him once more, citing Zimmerman's letters, Jeremiah smiled thinly and said, "The mind can appear whole until its cracks are struck. Margaret has always been fragile. A few words from a provincial doctor cannot erase years of decline." It was then that Elena noticed something terrible. Jeremiah's hand bore faint stains, yellowish at the cuticle, the same discoloration described in medical texts about handling certain toxic compounds. She did not speak of it aloud, but the sight convinced her that Margaret's suspicions had always been grounded in reality. The mansion was no longer merely a house. It had become a theater of control. Mirrors, passages, whispers, poison, and law, all bent to Jeremiah's desire. Yet with Sarah Quinn in possession of Zimmerman's testimony, and with Don Carlos determined to push forward, the first cracks in that design had begun to show. The question was whether Margaret could survive long enough for the truth to emerge. Sarah Quinn carried the copied letters wrapped in plain cloth beneath her shawl as she moved through Pittsburgh's narrow streets. The autumn air smelled of smoke from the mills, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, aware that Jeremiah's reach extended far beyond the iron gates of the Hartwell estate. She sought out a sympathetic magistrate, Judge Albright, a man rumored to distrust the growing influence of wealthy industrialists. When she laid the letters before him, he frowned deeply, tracing the careful script with his finger. "These," he said, "are not the words of a woman long diseased. If these are genuine, someone has lied under oath." Sarah swore their authenticity, describing Don Carlos's discovery of the hidden vials and Margaret's worsening condition. Albright promised to review the matter discreetly, but warned that evidence against a man of Jeremiah's standing must be overwhelming. "The law bends easily for men of his fortune," he told her, "but it does not break without noise." Back at the mansion, Margaret's decline accelerated. She could no longer walk unaided, her skin pale with a faint green cast. At times she murmured in Spanish, words Elena could not always understand, pleading for relief. Elena sat beside her sister-in-law's bed each night, stroking her hand, listening to her describe visions of corridors filled with mirrors, stretching into eternity. "She walks there," Margaret whispered. "The other me. If I go, Elena, do not follow. Promise me you won't follow." The mirrors themselves seemed to multiply. Elena discovered one newly hung at the end of a narrow hall where none had been before. Another appeared in the dining room, its surface so clear she thought she glimpsed someone move behind her when no one else was present. Servants crossed themselves quietly when polishing the glass, but never spoke of their unease. One night, unable to sleep, Elena followed a sound of scraping from the corridor outside her chamber. She pressed her ear against the paneling, and heard low voices, Jeremiah's among them, speaking through the hollow space. Though she could not catch every word, one phrase chilled her: "Increase the dosage." She must not linger past winter. The following day, Don Carlos insisted they could not delay. He and Elena searched the cellar more thoroughly, pushing aside crates until they uncovered a hidden compartment. Inside lay several small bottles labeled with medical terms Elena did not recognize, though one laudanum she knew as a powerful opiate. Another bore the faint emblem of a foreign chemist. Don Carlos sketched the bottle's appearance, adding the notes to his growing dossier. "This will hang him," he muttered, "if we can survive long enough to present it."
Sarah Quinn returned weeks later, slipping into the mansion under the pretense of visiting Elena as a distant acquaintance. She carried word that Judge Albright was preparing to convene a hearing. "But you must be ready," she warned. "Jeremiah will know. Men like him never wait to be accused. They strike before the blow can fall." Indeed, Jeremiah's demeanor shifted once more. He dined with Elena and Don Carlos in tense silence, his gaze steady, his fork scraping against the porcelain with deliberate slowness. When he spoke, it was with a calmness more frightening than anger. "I hear," he said, "that you've been entertaining strangers, Carlos. A poor habit in a house so steeped in grief." Margaret, half conscious at the end of the table, stirred and tried to speak. "He poisons," she whispered, but Jeremiah's hand clamped gently over hers, silencing her as though soothing a child. Elena felt the walls closing in. Each day brought a new mirror, a new shadow, a new tightening of Jeremiah's grip. But beyond the gates, Sarah's voice carried their story into the hands of the law. For the first time, there was hope, not yet safe, not yet secure, but alive. Still, Margaret's breathing grew shallow, her lips gray. Elena prayed each night that she would endure until the trial. Yet deep in her heart, she feared Margaret would not live to see Jeremiah brought to justice. The summons arrived on a brittle sheet of parchment, sealed with the magistrate's wax. Jeremiah Hartwell was to appear before the county court to answer charges of fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and suspected poisoning. Word spread quickly through Pittsburgh's taverns and marketplaces, whispers of the iron magnate whose fortune had been built on shadows, and of the women within his home who had withered under his care. On the morning of the hearing, carriages crowded the courthouse steps. Jeremiah entered flanked by 2 retainers, his composure unbroken, dressed in a coat of deep blue wool. He inclined his head to acquaintances in the gallery, as though arriving at a business meeting rather than a proceeding that might strip him of everything. Behind him, Elena and Don Carlos walked with measured steps, Sarah Quinn clutching the packet of letters as though it might burn her hands. Judge Albright presided from the bench. His voice was calm but edged with steel as he ordered Jeremiah to remain standing while the evidence was read. Sarah Quinn stepped forward first, her voice trembling but clear. She recited Dr. Zimmerman's words: persistent dosing with laudanum, deliberate weakening of the patient's faculties, suspicion of intentional harm. Each syllable hung heavy in the air. The defense rose quickly, arguing that Margaret's condition was a matter of hysteria, a common affliction among women of fragile constitution. They produced a physician loyal to Jeremiah, who testified that laudanum was a routine prescription. Yet as he spoke, Don Carlos placed the sketch of the hidden vials upon the table. The courtroom shifted with unease. Then came Elena's testimony. She described the mirrors, the voices through the walls, the nights she found Margaret gasping after meals. When Jeremiah's lawyer demanded why she had not spoken sooner, she replied, "Because every word I uttered was dismissed as a wife's fancy. But my eyes saw what they saw, and my ears heard what they heard." Gasps stirred the gallery. Jeremiah's gaze fixed upon her, cold and unblinking, as though willing her to collapse beneath the weight of it. But Elena did not waver. The final blow came with the servants' accounts. One after another, they spoke of strange instructions, meals prepared only under Jeremiah's watch, mirrors delivered at odd hours, orders to remain silent on pain of dismissal. The picture that emerged was not of a grieving husband, but of a man orchestrating a prison within his own house. Through it all, Margaret herself remained absent. Her condition had declined too swiftly for her to be moved, yet in her sickbed she whispered prayers that the truth might outlive her. Judge Albright recessed the court, announcing that further inquiry must include an examination of Margaret's body and the secret passages within the Hartwell mansion. Jeremiah's jaw tightened for the first time. For all his confidence, cracks had begun to show. That evening, the city murmured with speculation. Some swore Jeremiah would bribe the court, others believed he would flee before the trial resumed. Eleanor returned to the mansion under guard, where Margaret lay pale as wax, her breathing faint. Don Carlos took her hand and whispered, "Just a little longer, Hermana. Justice is moving now." But even as he spoke, the mirrors in the hall reflected back their weary figures, not as they were, but strangely distorted, as though some part of Jeremiah's power lingered within the glass itself. The order was given at dawn. The sheriff and his men were to search the Hartwell mansion from cellar to rafters. Lanterns swung in the gloom as boards were pried loose, hinges forced open, and walls tapped for hollows. What they uncovered silenced even the most skeptical. Behind Margaret's chamber lay a narrow corridor, its plaster newly patched, lined with slits no wider than a coin. From these apertures one could watch without being seen. Further within, shelves of empty glass vials and ledger books catalogued each dose administered over months, perhaps years. The sheriff carried one of the vials into the light. Its residue gave off a bitter metallic scent. Dr. Henley, summoned to examine it, declared that traces of belladonna clung to the glass. "In small doses," he explained gravely, "it clouds the mind, dilates the pupils, and weakens the heart. In larger, it kills." When this evidence was read aloud in court, Jeremiah did not flinch. He only smoothed his gloves and remarked that any man of industry kept tonics on hand for household ailments. Yet the murmurs among the jurors betrayed doubt. Meanwhile, Margaret's condition worsened. By late summer, she could scarcely raise her head. Elena remained at her side, reading from the Psalms while Don Carlos begged the magistrate for haste. But the law moves with deliberate steps, and Jeremiah's influence still weighed upon the city. On the 12th night of September, Margaret breathed her last. Her final words, barely audible, were to Elena, "Do not let him write the ending." Her body was borne from the mansion draped in white linen, the bells of St. Agnes tolling for her soul. At the funeral, Jeremiah walked among the mourners as though he were the chief victim, pressing gloved hands to lips, accepting condolences with practiced solemnity. Yet behind him, Sarah Quinn clutched her packet of letters, and Elena's gaze burned with silent accusation. The court ordered Margaret's body exhumed within the week. Physicians gathered to perform the autopsy. Their instruments revealed what whispers had long suggested: minute quantities of toxic compounds within her organs, consistent with prolonged exposure. The conclusion was unequivocal. Margaret Dunlap Hartwell had been poisoned. When this finding was announced, the gallery erupted. Some cried out for Jeremiah's immediate arrest. Others muttered prayers against the devil's work. The judge's gavel pounded until order returned, but the tide had turned. That night, under guard, Elena walked once more through the stripped halls of the mansion. The mirrors had been taken down, their frames piled like corpses in the courtyard, yet she swore the glass still whispered when the moonlight touched it. Don Carlos urged her away, but she lingered, tracing her fingers along the cold stone. "He thought these walls would silence us," she murmured, "but they will speak louder than he ever did." Outside, the townsfolk gathered in knots, debating not whether Jeremiah was guilty, but how deep his conspiracy had run. Some claimed other women had disappeared in his employ. Others insisted the mirrors themselves bore enchantments. Whatever the truth, the Hartwell name was now inseparable from dread, and Jeremiah. He remained calm, his eyes hooded, his voice measured, but those who watched closely swore his hands shook when the jailer locked the iron door. The trial convened in the courthouse of Allegheny County, a place more accustomed to disputes over land and contracts than the unraveling of a prominent man's life. Yet by the time Jeremiah Hartwell was brought in under guard, the chamber overflowed with spectators. Some leaned from the gallery railings, others pressed shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, eager to witness the spectacle. The newspapers had already named it the poisoning case, and vendors sold broadsheets outside, their ink still damp with accusations. Jeremiah carried himself with the same elegance he had always displayed, his frock coat immaculate, his cravat neatly tied. He offered the crowd a faint ironic smile, as though he were a guest of honor rather than the accused. But the chains at his wrists clinked softly, betraying the truth. The first to testify was Dr. Henley. His voice trembled as he described the vials, the ledgers, the hollow walls. He admitted his own complicity, that he had prescribed tonics without suspicion, that he had trusted Jeremiah's requests for consultations. "I believed myself a physician," he confessed, "but I was made a tool of murder." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Jeremiah merely folded his hands, eyes lowered as though the words were beneath his notice. Then came Sarah Quinn. She stepped forward, clutching the packet of letters, her cap trembling upon her head. She read aloud Margaret's last missives, accounts of strange flavors in her wine, of nights where the ceiling seemed to pulse, of voices whispering through the mirrors. Her voice cracked when she reached the plea: "If I am silenced, know that it was no madness but design." The court fell silent. Even the judge's stern visage softened. Elena, pale but resolute, followed. She recounted the nights of Margaret's torment, the hidden corridors she herself had glimpsed, the figure in the glass that was not her own. When Jeremiah's lawyer objected, claiming grief had unsettled her reason, Elena only fixed Jeremiah with a steady gaze. "You told me once that she was ill. I tell you now it was you who made her so." The murmurs that rose could not be contained. Don Carlos spoke last. He was measured, recounting how Margaret's decline had coincided with Jeremiah's increasing wealth, how every remedy had worsened rather than healed. His testimony lent the weight of reason to the haunting details. Together, the voices of servant, widow, and friend painted a portrait that no rhetoric could easily erase. The defense strained to discredit them, to suggest hysteria, coincidence, or superstition. But the vials, the letters, the very walls of the mansion stood as mute witnesses. Each revelation tightened the noose of suspicion. When the judge adjourned for the day, the crowd spilled into the streets, carrying the story like wildfire. Some swore they had seen Jeremiah glance at the empty air beside him, as though still consulting with unseen counsel. Others whispered that Margaret's spirit herself stalked the chamber, demanding justice. That night, thunder rolled over the city. In his cell, Jeremiah sat upright, refusing rest. A guard later swore he heard him muttering, "Mirrors break, but reflections endure." The stage was set for judgment, but whether the law would deliver what the dead demanded remained uncertain. The courtroom filled again with the same fervor that had gripped Pittsburgh for weeks, though now the mood was sharper, less speculative. Word had spread that evidence from the Hartwell mansion had been brought forth, and whispers of exhumation carried a chill through the crowd. The judge, a man of strict demeanor, called for order, but anticipation hung so heavy it seemed the wooden rafters themselves strained under it. The prosecution's most damning piece was Margaret Hartwell's body, or rather what science had coaxed from it. Physicians testified in grave tones that traces of antimony and mercury, substances sometimes used in minute doses for treatment, had been found in her remains at levels no patient could endure. Not medicine, one expert declared, but poison, administered with persistence and intent. The words echoed like a funeral bell. Elena covered her face, tears streaking through her fingers. She had braced herself for confirmation, yet hearing it aloud forced the horror into flesh and blood. Margaret had not merely wasted away, she had been extinguished, drop by drop, by the man who still sat smirking only feet away. Jeremiah's defense attempted to turn the revelation on its head. His attorney argued that primitive medical practices of the day often involved such compounds. If poison lingered in Margaret's body, it was the result of misguided but common treatments, not a husband's hand. Are we to condemn a man for trusting his physicians? The lawyer asked, gesturing at the embarrassed Dr. Henley. Yet the jury saw in Henley a man undone by shame, and in Jeremiah a figure untouched by remorse. The contrast spoke louder than words. Then the prosecution unveiled the hidden passages themselves, or what had been recovered from them. Lanterns, stools, and panes of glass, all arranged to channel a cruel illusion. Witnesses described how, through angled mirrors, Jeremiah had conjured the double image in Margaret's chamber, the phantom that had driven her to despair. The crowd recoiled at the ingenuity. Not content to weaken her body, he had sought to unravel her mind. In the gallery, Sarah Quinn clutched her rosary so tightly the beads imprinted her palms. She whispered that she could still hear Margaret's footsteps in the halls at night, as though the testimony had not banished the dead, but summoned them closer. The jury withdrew at dusk. By candlelight they deliberated, and when they returned, their faces bore the solemnity of men who had glimpsed the abyss. The foreman's voice was steady as he pronounced the word guilty. A hiss of relief passed through the chamber, followed by applause that the judge struggled to silence. Jeremiah only inclined his head. "The world is an illusion," he murmured, audible only to those nearest. "One day you shall see how poorly you have judged me." He met Elena's eyes then, not with hatred, but with a terrible calm, as if she were merely another reflection in a long gallery of mirrors. Sentence was swift. The gallows awaited him, yet the verdict did not lift the shadow entirely. Elena returned home trembling, her nights broken by dreams of Margaret calling from within the walls. Even Don Carlos, steadfast though he was, confessed to hearing knocks in the corridors of his boarding house, faint but insistent. The city exhaled, believing justice had been served. But for those who had walked the halls of the Hartwell mansion, the trial had not ended the haunting. It had only given it a new shape. The morning of Jeremiah Hartwell's execution dawned grey, a sky the colour of iron pressing low over the city. Crowds gathered near the scaffold, their breath clouding in the autumn chill, their voices hushed with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Vendors hawked hot cider and pamphlets recounting his crimes, proof that even in death, infamy had a market. The bells of a nearby church tolled, each peal resonating like a countdown. Jeremiah ascended the wooden steps with unnerving composure. Shackles clinked at his wrists, yet he carried himself as though entering a banquet hall. A faint smile lingered on his lips, the same he had worn in court, as though he remained amused by the spectacle of human judgment. When asked if he had final words, he looked not at the crowd but at the sky, his voice steady and cold. "You see walls and ceilings where I see windows. You call it justice, I call it blindness. But in the end the mirror will claim us all." The hangman adjusted the noose, the rope taut against his neck. For a breathless instant the city seemed to hold still, then the trapdoor fell away. His body swung in silence, save for the creak of hemp and wood. No cry, no struggle. Jeremiah Hartwell left the world as he had lived within it, cloaked in an aura of calculated calm, leaving behind only unease. Elena, shielded by Don Carlos from the press of onlookers, could not bring herself to watch. Instead she pressed her face against his shoulder and wept. Not for Jeremiah, but for Margaret, for the nights filled with terror, for all the women whose truths had been smothered by disbelief. The sound of the crowd roaring as the sentence was fulfilled brought no comfort. Justice, though served, could not erase what had been endured. In the months that followed, Elena departed Pittsburgh for the quieter rhythms of Pennsylvania's countryside. There she began, cautiously, to rebuild her life. Don Carlos remained at her side until his business pulled him back to Spain, but their bond never faded, sustained through letters that carried across the sea. Elena remarried in time, finding steadier companionship with a merchant whose trade brought her safety rather than suspicion. She bore children, tended a modest household, and to outward eyes resumed the life Jeremiah had nearly stolen from her. Yet she never again spoke of the Hartwell mansion beyond what she had testified at trial. That silence, like a locked chest, held the echo of everything she could not forget. The house itself fared less well. Purchased to cover debts, it was stripped of its mirrors, its passages sealed, its grand chamber divided into smaller rooms.
Railroad men slept where Margaret had once wasted away, the laughter of boarders filling spaces once ruled by whispers. Still, the building was spoken of in lowered tones, a place where walls had too many memories. By the turn of the century, the mansion was demolished, its foundations buried beneath the sprawl of industry, its sins swallowed but not erased. The legacy of the case lingered in other forms. Laws in Pennsylvania shifted, requiring independent medical examinations before commitment to asylums, closing a loophole Jeremiah had exploited. Physicians, chastened by the revelations, began to treat accusations of poisoning with greater seriousness. Dr. Penley, tormented by his unwitting role, dedicated his remaining years to researching toxic compounds and advocating for women's medical rights, his reputation reshaped by remorse. Yet even as reforms were written, questions remained. How many others had suffered as Margaret and Elena had? How many hysterical women had been silenced by a husband's convenient diagnosis? Historians who sifted the records would find scattered hints, cases too vague to prove, too common to pursue, that suggested the Hartwell affair was no anomaly. It was a window into a wider darkness. By 1985, the land where the mansion once stood had been converted into a small public park, the noise of the city softened by trees. On its edge, a bronze marker was unveiled, inscribed with words stark and simple, in memory of Margaret Dunlap Hartwell, Elena Rodriguez Hartwell, and all victims of medical abuse. Their courage in seeking truth, despite overwhelming obstacles, helped establish protections that endure to this day. Visitors paused before it, some curious, some reverent, some unaware of the shadows beneath their feet. The Hartwell case endures not only as a story of crime, but as a warning. It shows how fragile trust can be, how authority can warp into cruelty, and how easily women's voices can be dismissed when their truths strain belief. The mirrors are gone, the passages sealed, the mansion razed, but the questions remain, lingering like a draft in a closed room. Was everything revealed? Or do other victims, unnamed and unremembered, still haunt the spaces between the lines of history? What do you think? Could the Hartwell conspiracy have been only one glimpse into a far larger silence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this tale unsettled you, subscribe, share and join us again for the next descent into forgotten shadows.